Good afternoon, everybody. Firstly, I'd like to thank Chancellor Yamada and Professor Yoshikawa for inviting me to this very exciting symposium, and I am honored to be here. This is my first visit to Japan, and I hope it won't be the last one. Firstly, I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself. I am a medical doctor by background, but also trained in public health, the specialty that we call sort of general health sciences, if you like. And but I have spent most of my career in research, actually mainly studying drugs, but also studying the causes of disease. But today what I'd like to talk about is the role of data, particularly big data, in helping us promote a long and healthy life. Now, if we go back into history, data has always been important. This is a picture of a doctor, Dr. John Snow, who was practicing medicine in Victorian London. In 1854, so 160 odd years ago, there were recurrent epidemics of cholera. And the prevailing view at that time was that cholera was due to bad air. So in other words, was spread by breath and droplets. But Dr. Snow thought that probably that wasn't the case, but he hadn't yet convinced anybody else. So he mapped all the deaths from cholera that occurred during this epidemic, and he noticed that they all centered round one particular water pump. So this was before the days when people had running water in their homes, and they relied on getting water from a central pump. And Dr. Snow decided to remove the handle from that pump to make it unusable. And from that moment onwards, the cholera epidemic began to decline. And it wasn't until some years later that the theories of bacteria and germs became accepted. But this is a very nice early use of data and the importance, and one of the sort of standard teaching exercises that we have in population health. So, but I think that it's slightly ironic that you should ask somebody from the UK to talk about a long, healthy life, because, as you all know, in Japan you have the greatest life expectancy, as you can see here, and as Professor Hori was telling you as well. So in general, people in Japan live longer, although, as I was hearing, they don't perceive that they live long, healthy lives. But this, in many ways, is a great success story. And I think many of us elsewhere in the world look forward to learning from Japan about how we can better have healthy aging. It's not universal, of course, and in many parts of the world, and I've just chosen Nigeria, a very large country in Africa, to illustrate that this is still a major problem in many parts of the world. Of course, much of this is related to the HIV epidemic, but also related to many other sort of adverse social factors. But we know what has led to many of these improvements in life expectancy, and these are just listed here, things that are sort of obvious really from a public health point of view. Perhaps here in Japan, and several people have commented on the lower fertility being an important cause. And I think what I mean by that is that in societies where there are very large numbers of children, for example, in some of the poorer African countries where childhood mortality is high, the investment and the amount of care given to children is much less. And in general, in societies which have lower fertility, children survive better. They're better fed, they're better looked after. So although I recognize that low fertility is perceived as an issue here at the moment, in global health terms, actually family planning and reducing reducing family size is a very important part of improving longevity. But there's also good news really of all the way around the world. And this, because most of what I've just shown you were the measures that have helped us live into middle age. And the key issue now is how can we go from healthy middle age into healthy old age? And these are data from the 25 largest, most populous countries in the world, and the trends in death rates in middle age over the last 40 or so years. And as you can see, almost universally, there have been great declines in the death rates across the world. There are a few exceptions to that. The African countries that have suffered most from HIV, Russia, which has had both economic upheaval but also has a major problem with alcohol intake. But in the developed countries, and again, Japan doing very with the lowest death rates now in middle age. And what is this due to? Well, in middle age, this is largely due to declines both in heart disease and stroke, what we call vascular causes of death. I've just chosen UK and Japan here. Massive declines in the rates of heart disease. These little blips are probably due to the ways things are recorded rather than real issues. So I'm not going to emphasize that. But what I will emphasize, and you may not be able to read this, is that the top here is 500 or 600 in the UK, and here is just 120 in Japan. So in Japan, your heart disease rates have been much lower than in the Western world. But if we move to stroke, we see the opposite pattern. Again, we see massive declines in the rates in both the UK and in Japan. Sorry, I failed to label these. But here, the numbers here in Japan are much higher for stroke than they are in the UK for stroke. So here, this is 140 and this is 400. So similar patterns of decline, but very different patterns regionally, which are partially understood, but not fully understood. And what are the causes of these massive declines? Well, these are from sort of classic epidemiology, but these are the most important causes, which probably you're all familiar with. Tobacco, smoking, major cause both of the underlying disease, but also the decline in smoking, contributing to those declines. Blood pressure, a major cause of disease, and blood lipids. So by that I mean the fats in our blood, particularly blood cholesterol. And it may well be that cholesterol is a bigger issue in the UK, for example, contributing to our heart disease, and perhaps blood pressure has been a bigger issue in Japan, contributing especially to the stroke rates. In the UK, obesity is a major driver of both the lipids and the blood pressure, although in Japan, you're very fortunate that you've not had the same massive increase in obesity that we've seen in Western countries. I was looking at some of the statistics this morning, and I think you have 10-fold lower rates of obesity, for example, than in the United States. And I hope that that will last into the future and that you won't begin to copy some of the Western countries. So this is all as a result of old epidemiology, but based on data. And it's been large numbers that has helped us understand these causes. And I'm going to just briefly mention Sir Richard Doll, who was a very eminent epidemiologist in the UK. Indeed, I work in a building that is named after him, and I knew him because he worked latterly. He lived right through until his 90s. But in his early career, he was asked to investigate in particular, the rise in lung cancer that was being investigated, which was being observed in the Western populations in the early part of the 20th century. He actually believed initially that that was likely to be due to the fumes from cars. So he did some initial investigations and realized that smoking was probably very important. Therefore, he set up a study which became known as the British Doctors Study. He identified from the public register of doctors in the UK the names and addresses of all the practicing doctors in 1951. He wrote to all those doctors with a questionnaire and asked them about their smoking habits. He then linked that information over the long term to the number of deaths and the causes of death among those British doctors. And because he lived a very long time, he gave up smoking as soon as he realized the importance of smoking. So although he did smoke in his 20s, I think he gave up in his 30s. But what he found was that after 50 years, most of those doctors had died. But on average, the people who continued to smoke had died on average 10 years earlier than the people who didn't smoke, or indeed who stopped smoking very early on in their adult life. And it was this use of large numbers. So he had mailed 34,000 British doctors. At that time, most of the doctors were men. Fortunately, that's not the case anymore, but at that time, so he really only studied male doctors. But it was this long-term follow-up over 50 years that allowed them to get these really major insights, which is that the risk of smoking on disease is huge. About half of the people who continued smoking would die prematurely because of a smoking-related disease. And about a quarter of those people were dying in middle age. And they also worked out that stopping smoking worked. So there's always a good news bit of it too. So let's just briefly turn to blood pressure now. And I'm going to again illustrate why blood pressure also needs large numbers. So many of the early studies of blood pressure included a relatively small number of people. So studies of around 5,000 people. One of the most widely cited studies was an American study called the Framingham study, which took about 5,000 people living in a small American community, measured a lot of things in them, and followed up their health. And a lot of the understanding that we've got about what causes what disease is from the Framingham study. But when you look at a plot like this and you try to associate or correlate the blood pressure, which is along this axis here, so this is average blood pressure at around 120, high blood pressure 180, and heart disease rates, and you look at different ages, you just get a muddle. The vertical lines here are around a dot, which is the sort of estimate for that effect of blood pressure in that age, and the vertical lines represent the uncertainty around that because of small numbers. When we increase the sample size from 5,000 to 50,000, you begin to see these relationships coming into focus. But even so, there's still a little bit of uncertainty around the exact pattern. Is this really a straight line, or is there a curving here? But when we move to 500,000 people, you see this pattern absolutely comes into focus. And we see very clearly that for every level of blood pressure at every age, having a higher blood pressure is associated with a higher risk, in this case of heart disease, but exactly the same pattern is seen for stroke. So this is data based on a study called the Prospective Studies Collaboration, run by colleagues of mine, which gathered together data on 1 million people. And this is just data from about 500,000 people. But you can see how big numbers really helps us clarify these sort of patterns. And from these sort of patterns, we can work out that the simple messages, the messages that are helpful from a public health point of view, that a 10 millimeter higher blood pressure or lower blood pressure is associated with about a third fewer deaths from heart disease and stroke in middle age. So even in middle age, this is important, and it's even more important probably in old age. So now I'd like to get a little bit personal and talk about one of the other major problems that face us as an aging society. And these are my two aunts. So this is my aunt on my mother's side, my mother's older sister. This is the aunt on my father's side, my father's old sister. And the key similarity between these two is that they both died with dementia. Each of them, so what do we mean by that? Well, they lost their memory, they lost their reasoning power, they lost their ability to speak later on, and they gradually declined over the course of a 7 to 10 year period. Very distressing for everybody around. And as I'm sure you all know, because you probably all know people who've got dementia at the moment, and what we all want to know is how we can avoid it. What can we do to both stop ourselves and our relatives developing this? And as you can see here, the risks are large. So by the age of 65, about 3% may have dementia, but it doubles every 5 years or so. So that by the time we're in our 80s and 90s, about 1 in 3 of us on current projections may have dementia. So this is a major, major problem. So how can big data help with this? And what is big data? Well, of course, there's data all around us. We're collecting data. We're giving away data all the time. When we shop, when we bank, when we go on public transport, when we use social media, when we use our phones, and so on. Most of this data, at the moment, of course, goes to those big giants, Google, Facebook, Netflix, Amazon, who are greedily absorbing all that data in order to make money out of it. But what we need to be able to do is use data to promote health. This sort of data that is being collected is messy. It's difficult to interpret. It's difficult to link with other things. But that's not to say that it might not be usable in controlled circumstances. But for data to be valuable in health research, it needs to include a lot of people. As I was showing you earlier on, the difference between 500,000 and 5,000 in terms of understanding exposures is very important. We need to be able to measure a range of different exposures. Now, what do we mean by exposures? We mean anything from the air we breathe to the diet to our physiological things to our genetic makeup and so on. And we need to link those things to what happens to people, whether it be heart disease or strokes or dementia or arthritis or whatever the sort of bad outcomes that we're trying to avoid. And we need frequent measurements, we need long-term measurements, as I showed you with the British Doctors study, and we need a good level of detail in those measurements. And by bringing together those things, we have the power to understand disease better and we hope to intervene sooner. I'm going to tell you just about one study in the UK. This is not unique, but it is one of a limited number of large prospective studies, which I hope will help us all understand disease better. Now, the UK Biobank study has surveyed and collected data on 500,000 UK adults. It actually includes my information. I'm one of these 500,000 adults who was surveyed between 2007 and 2010. Very rapid recruitment across a variety of cities in the UK. The data that's been collected on this study is vast already. So at the initial visit, people gave lifestyle information by a detailed questionnaire. They gave information about their drug use, their past medical history. They gave blood and urine samples, which have gone into huge deep freezes, which is what this picture is. Have just been released the genetic data from the blood samples on all these people. They've done cognitive tests, so that's tests of brain power, which I'll come back to, diet, and so on. And I'll come back to 1 in 5 of these people, so 100,000 people are going to have total body scans, so with MRI scanners of the head, the chest, the heart, the abdomen, and the bones, and so on. And one of the things is that this data is open to all researchers around the world. If you're a bona fide health researcher, you can apply to use this data. And there are already very many publications coming out of this, which can be found on the UK Biobank website. So diet is a major exposure, which may explain some of those differences between heart disease and stroke, between Japan and the West. It may not, but it is vitally important to understand, but so difficult to measure. So the hope is by doing repeated measurements of diet at the moment it's about 300,000 have given repeated data about their diet from the UK Biobank study using online questionnaires. Also activity. So most of the data we know about the health benefits of activity have been based on questionnaire data. How often do you run? How often do you play sports? How many hours a week do you sit watching television, and so on? But this study has used wrist-worn accelerometers to actually measure the diet, and they will have data in about 100,000 people. This is some of the early looks at that data, showing, as we might expect, declining activity with age, and also patterns varying during the day, so that in the afternoons we're less active than in the mornings, and this is more pronounced in older than in younger individuals. So the hope is that by being able to link this sort of data to health records in due course, we'll be able to get better ideas of how much and how frequently, and what sort of patterns of activity are most beneficial. There are also cognitive tests. So this is just one of many tests done as an online test of your brain function, testing your memory, your reasoning, so to try and match the symbols to create numbers, to give repeated measurements. So everybody did this at the baseline, and then by email people are asked to repeat it over time, so that we can get a pattern of what's happening to people's cognitive function over time. And this then is linked to people's health records. So at the initial visit, people were asked for their consent to link that information that had been collected to what happens to them. And in the UK, we have a National Health Service with centralised electronic health records. So this is just some of the data from the last few years. So, and these are the numbers of people among the 500,000 who are part of UK Biobank who've been into hospital with different diseases. You can see up here that it's arthritis is the most common, and that I believe is related to joint replacements, knee joint and hip joint replacements, which in the UK are particularly linked to obesity and are linked to our real problems in the West with obesity. But next down is heart disease, asthma, diabetes, all the common things. Right down at the bottom at the moment is dementia. But of course, this is early days. This is only 5 or 6 years worth of data. And the power of the UK Biobank study will be in 10, 20 years' time, when the cohort of middle-aged people will have aged significantly. And we hope it will help us understand some of those early stages. Because we do know, so these are just estimates of the numbers of hospital admissions and things that will happen to these biobank participants over the coming years. So even by now, there are very large numbers with different outcomes. And so studies can be done comparing, say, the 5,000 people who've had a stroke with thousands of people who've not had a stroke, and try and work out what it is about those people from their genetics, from their exposure data that makes them at risk. And similarly for all the cancers, which of course are also a major problem and particularly related to age. So I wanted to go back to my aging aunts, or my now deceased aunts, and we know a bit about what are the causes of dementia. There are two main patterns of dementia. One, Alzheimer's disease, and the other, what we call vascular dementia, particularly related to having strokes and having high blood pressure. And we know that these factors, which are important for heart disease and stroke, are also important risk factors for dementia. But we also know that there are genetic factors that play a part, as well as of course, age. And age is a major problem. We know this is not data from UK Biobank, but this is data from some other studies that I've been involved in, based on about 45,000 people who are mainly well and healthy. So these are not people with dementia, but sort of sadly, really, after the age of about 60, we see this decline in our cognitive ability. So this is just based on a brief test that tested memory, reasoning, logic, and so on. And we can see age-related declines. But of course, within these averages, there's vast variation. And as I say, what we really need to understand is what makes one person get dementia and not the next person. And much of those secrets may lie in our genetics. So the 500,000 people in UK Biobank have all had their genomes sequenced. As you all know, we are all slightly different. And across our strings of genes, there are lots of places where there are small variations. And these variations have now been mapped across these 500,000 people. And that information is just now, over the last few weeks, been made available to the researchers around the world who have registered an interest in the biobank data. So we hope over the next few years to see an explosion of interest in the genetics of disease. But the other thing that might help our understanding of dementia will be the 100,000 people who will agree to have their brains scanned. And we hope that by understanding what these scans tell us about the early stages of disease, of dementia, what it is, we already know a little bit about it. We know that there's one particular area of the brain which begins to shrink in Alzheimer's, but we don't know whether there are other things going on. And we hope that these scans in these very large numbers of people will help us understand that a little better. So UK Biobank, I think, as I say, is one of many studies, but will help us by having measured all these different things. So questionnaires, cognitive function, as I've told you, diet. They've also measures of lung function to help us perhaps better understand the adverse effects of air pollution. They've got this information on very large numbers. They've also looked at the eyes. They've done retinal imaging. They've measured activity, and they will be doing all this imaging. So I think this is very exciting, and I hope that maybe some of your researchers who will be part of your School of Health Sciences will be able to use some of this data as well. And it may also help in planning studies that would help better understand the situation here in Japan. So big data has huge potential for enabling us to live long and healthy lives. It's already transformed our ability to track disease, to develop drugs and vaccines much more rapidly, as we saw, for example, with the Ebola epidemic. By the end of the epidemic, an effective vaccine had been developed. Unfortunately, too late for those thousands of people who died, but at least it means that we should avoid a future catastrophic epidemic such as that was. And the combining of the electronic medical data and possibly some of the other big data that is constantly being collected around the world, we can better understand and be able to work out what it is that we should be doing to live longer and healthier lives. The aim, obviously, is to try and find out what we need to do. We know lots of things that we can do. I know that I shouldn't smoke, that I should take more exercise, that I need a good diet, control my blood pressure. But what else can I do to avoid the fates of my aunts and develop dementia? I don't know. And I'd like to know, because I don't want that fate. And big data may help us with the understanding of these causes in the ways I've explained. So thank you very much for your attention and for inviting me. Thank you.